Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville, 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Thank you, Davine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM on Wall Street in downtown Asheville. Robin Collier, thank you for managing KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, out of Taos, New Mexico. If you'd like to reach me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd like to remind you that we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you would like to improve your writing chops, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to look. I've been involved in that project for a long time, and it's changed the way I write, and I expect if you explore it a bit, you might find the same result. Also keep in mind that coming up on May 19th through 25 at Lake Eden, about 10 minutes west of Black Mountain, 20 minutes east of Asheville, I'm hosting the Lake Eden Writing Retreat with Alan Wolf, Nicole Brown, Sebastian Matthews, and other speakers. It's going to be a week of writing and collaborating. We'll be working with memoir, poetry, bit of novel writing, great deal of conversations about the craft of writing, and some deep dive into revision. How do you upgrade what you've written so that it moves you closer and closer to publishing what you generated? So those are some of the things that we will work with. Plus, we'll just get to know each other better. And Lake Eden is an absolutely gorgeous spot. It will be the third week of May, full springtime in the Southern Highlands, and the flowers will be out, the birds will be singing, and hopefully so will we. Perhaps we'll have a little campfire, who knows? You can go to jamesnavé.com, spelled N-A-V-E, and you'll find the link to the page that tells you all about it. So perhaps it's something you would like to do. We have room for 4 more right now, so if it's something you're interested in, please consider it. I would appreciate it, and so would everybody else who's coming. Today I'm going solo with this show because I have something I've been thinking about that's intriguing me quite a bit. It's on the subject of storytelling. You may be familiar with the moth storytelling movement, telling a true story from your life to an audience somewhere in the world. There's also the moth story slam, which is a derivative, really, of the poetry slam, which I've been involved with for many, many years. The poetry slam is competitive poetry on a stage, judged like a diving match. The judges are chosen arbitrarily from the audience, and they score the poets 0 to 10, just like in a diving match, and decimal points are encouraged because it avoids ties. You have 5 judges, as I said. You drop the high score, you drop the low score, you keep the middle 3, and that's how you end up with a score somewhere between 0 and 30. The Moth Story Slam takes the same approach. You have the 5 judges, and instead of poetry, each participant stands up, has 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the time frames, to perform a story off the cuff, without notes, a true story about something that happened in their lives. It's a variation on the poetry slam, and yet it's the same idea. The term slam comes from baseball. The grand slam in baseball. Can you connect so well emotionally with your poem or your story, the audience responds at the end at the same level they would respond if the stadium was filled and the World Series was down to the last pitch, bottom of the 9th, bases are loaded, and the home team has to get a grand slam in order to win the series. And lo and behold, it's the last pitch of the game, the batter knocks it out of the park, the audience goes wild, they win the series with a grand slam. If you can connect with your poem like that, or your story, and the audience goes wild, then that would be a 10. And that's the idea behind the poetry slam as well as the story slam. It's really not about slamming your opponent on the stage and jumping up and down on them and beating them up. It's really about, can you go internally and give the audience something
they will remember. Give them something that they will feel so connected to, they think they told the story and you didn't. It becomes a relationship between you and the audience if you happen to be the teller on the stage. Unlike the Poetry Slam, the Moth Story Slam is branded, it's trademarked, it has its own specific usages. The Poetry Slam is more broad-based. Everybody can use the term Poetry Slam. It doesn't have a trademark, it's not copyrighted, it's a free-form idea. So when I refer to the Moth Story Slam, I'm only referring to the Moth Story Slam because you have probably heard of it. Now, you're free to do your own Story Slam, and you can call it anything you want. You can call it the Soft Rock Story Slam, or the Falling Star Story Slam, or the Shoelace Story Slam, or the Around the Block Story Slam, or whatever name you want to put in front of Story Slam. You just aren't free to call it the Moth Story Slam. The reason I bring this up is because I'm planning to host a Story Slam Friday, May 10th at the Lake Eden Retreat, which is a smaller version of the Leaf Festival, which is held here at Lake Eden every October. The Lake Eden Retreat is a learning event as well as a festival, as well as a gathering of the tribe. Folks come, it's springtime, leaves are out, everything's beautiful, it's warm, it's a great way to launch the summer.
Plus, it's a great opportunity to tell a story if you have one you would like to tell. And so, on that note, what I would like to explore in this podcast is how do you develop a story? How do you come up with something that you can tell on the stage that's true, authentic, comes from your life, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, a good narrative, and a payoff somehow. So staying focused on the Leaf Story Slam, which is coming up in May, the theme is World Changers, and World Changers, the theme is World Changers, which is the theme for the entire year for the Leaf Global Arts Organization. And now that title reflects not only our aspirations, but also the impact each of us makes on the world. So the first question you have to ask is, when you're developing this story of yours, do I qualify as a world changer? And the answer is absolutely, you do, and here's why. So consider your everyday life. Consider how a kind word can turn someone's day around. Or imagine the chain reaction when you hold a door open with a smile. Such acts, though small, can ignite a cascade of positivity. And this illustrates how your influence can ripple across the human lake. So it doesn't have to be large. It just can be almost anything that changes the world. I like to say that you are responsible for the first ripple, and the lake will take care of the rest. So here's the brief for the World Changers Story Slam. Prepare a 3 to 5 minute personal true story about a time when art inspired you to make changes that influenced or changed the world around you. So whether it's an impactful moment in your life, or maybe you've been to one of the Leaf events, and it's an impactful moment at a Leaf event, or a line of poetry somebody recited to you, or just a transformational view of a skyline, or a song that moved you to action like Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And the action doesn't have to be some huge action. The action could be simply a change in perspective, some change in your mood, something that moved you in a different direction, allowed you to make a decision that you were thinking about but weren't quite sure of how to make. And of course, when you look back on that small decision and you track that decision and how it led you to the next beat, and the next beat, or decision after decision after decision, you can get a sense of how something very small can grow quickly into something very large that will influence the people around you. And within that influence lies the circle of change, and that change ripples out into the world, and you really will never be able to know exactly how it plays, because the people it ripples to you'll probably never meet. So then, from the point of view of developing a story, how do you create a story? How do you even decide what piece of art changed you so then it influenced you to change the world? So I have to admit that when I first came up with a theme for the Leaf World Changers Story Slam, prepare a 3 to 5 minute personal true story about a time when art inspired you to make changes that influenced or changed the world around you, when I came up with that theme, I thought, well, that will be easy. And so when I started to think about it, I quickly realized that it wasn't as easy as I thought. And I was wondering, well, why is this so difficult? It should be easy to come up with a time when art influenced me to make a small or large change in my life that changed the people around me. And I realized that I was thinking about art from a very narrow point of view. I was thinking of a painting, or a great photograph, or a great piece of music. Operative word here, great. I was thinking of something dynamic, something fantastic, something great. Had to be very, very important. I've done a lot of thinking around this, and if you and I were in a conversation, I would tell you to eliminate great. And yet, the moment I start to try to develop a story based on a piece of art that influenced me, I defaulted back to my conditioning, something great. How did the Mona Lisa influence me? Well, I did see the Mona Lisa one time, and it didn't really influence me all that much. I also had a chance to see the girl with the pearl earring, another painting. I also had a chance to see Vermeer's girl with a pearl ear. I also had a chance to see Vermeer's girl with a pearl earring, and it moved me more than the Mona Lisa. But it didn't change me. It didn't change the way I think. It didn't alter my life. I didn't go away from that great painting and do something in my life that created a change that affected the people around me. So I realized if I stayed narrowly focused on the great art, I would never get anywhere. So that's when I pulled back and started to think of artistic things rather than art. An artistic thing would be, as I said earlier, a line of poetry, something beautiful that you catch in the morning out of your left eye or your right eye, something that wouldn't necessarily be considered great and might not even be considered art by other people. And yet in a moment you can be moved by something artistic, some piece of art. Maybe you glimpse a poster in a window walking down the street. Or maybe you hear Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah sung by a busker on the street. Who knows where it comes from? So when you broaden your perspective around art and how it influences you, it makes it a lot easier to come up with a story. So that's what I did. So what I'd like to do now is unpack the story a bit to give you an idea of how you can make a story around how art influenced you and to turn it into a story that you can feel comfortable telling on the stage, no matter whether it's at the Leaf World Changers Story Slam or other story slams around the country. You can also go to the Moth Story Slams and do the same thing there. So the first thing you need to pay attention to when you're developing your story is how many minutes do you have to tell your story in? It's important to know that. Usually you have between 5 and 7 minutes to tell the story. You will soon discover, however, that when you're unpacking the story, it's much longer than that. So the first thing to remember is keep in mind the length you have on stage, while at the same time, don't worry about that so much when you're developing your story. Let it unfold. Let it unfold over whatever time it needs. And the reason why is even though you have a time limit on the Story Slam stage, when you develop your story, you also have other opportunities to tell it where you don't have that time limit. So the 7-minute story can actually be expanded into a 20, 25, or 30-minute story, even longer if you like. But that comes later. First you have to figure out what the story is, down, get a sense of the narrative, and then shorten it so that you can fit it into whatever required time frame you have for the presentation you're preparing for. So in this case, the Story Slam is 5 to 7 minutes. So the first thing I had to do when I was thinking about what story I would tell, I had to determine first what was the piece of art that motivated me, and then from there, what actions did I take to create change. It's pretty simple, and yet it's a little bit more difficult to come up with the story because you have to assess the changes that took place after you encountered the art, and that's what I had to do. And for a while I couldn't think of anything, and the reason why was because I was thinking
on a bigger scale than I needed to. And then I started to think about the changes that I had been involved in, the activities that I had done, things that I had promoted or collaborated with other people to make happen. And that's when I thought, now I see where to go with this. So what I did in 1992 in collaboration with Alan Wolfe, Ginger West, and Lee Lancaster in Asheville at the Green Door, what I did was help create the Asheville Poetry Slam. As I said earlier, the Story Slam is a derivative of the Poetry Slam, which came first. So how did I end up collaborating to create a Poetry Slam in Asheville? So that was where I started. So I didn't start with the art first. I started with an event that I knew had changed things. And how did it change things? So we started the Poetry Slam in Asheville in 1992. And it took about a year or maybe less for people to recognize there was something going on, something interesting, something experimental happening at the Green Door on Carolina Lane in downtown Asheville. And once people started to discover it, folks from around the country came to be part of our Poetry Slam. And when I say folks around the country, these were people who were working in the Poetry Slam in different venues throughout the country, and they knew they could come because we invited them to come, and we invited them to feature at the Poetry Slam. And once that started, things in Asheville really started to turn around. And even to this day, you can look around and see the spoken word venues and the different approaches that people take with poetry and storytelling. And there's a Moth Story Slam in Asheville. I host the Poetry Slam every October at the Leaf Festival, which is just outside of Asheville. And now I'm doing the Leaf World Changer Story Slam this May. So it's very easy to see the thread from that night at TT and the Bears all the way through decades to 2024 and the Leaf World Changer Story Slam in May, which directly threads to the Leaf Poetry Slam, which started because of the Asheville Poetry Slam, and the Asheville Poetry Slam started because Alan and I went to TT and the Bears and saw Patricia and Ray. It would be fair to say that night at TT and the Bears, with Ray and Patricia on stage, presenting art in a way we had never seen it, and then encouraging us to continue in that tradition, that was the moment. That was when a piece of art informed me, changed me, inspired me to come back to the Asheville community and make changes. It's more take action that created changes rather than it would, to be more accurate, I would say, to be more accurate, inspired me to come back to the Asheville community along with Alan, Ginger, and Lee, inspired me to come back to the Asheville community and participate in making something that created a lot of ripples that went out across the lake, created a lot of change. So there's a direct tie between those two. So how did that happen? What happened that night? How did we manage to get to TT and the Bears? Well, here's how it started. I was touring New England with Alan Wolfe, and Alan Wolfe and I were in Natick, Massachusetts, and we were performing spoken word poetry for school kids, K through 12, touring in a theater company called Poetry Alive. And the school day had ended. The Gulf War was going on, the first Gulf War. You can look that up online and see the reference. And that was the beginning of all the conflict that continues to this day in the Middle East. And the Gulf War was going on. Alan and I were performing poetry, and we'd finished our work, and we'd gone to Uno's Pizza in Natick, Massachusetts to have a late lunch. And we were sitting there having our lunch, talking about poetry, performing, and we really thought we were the best performance poets in the country. Absolutely thought we were the best. And Suzanne, who was the server taking care of our table, started up a conversation with us. What are you guys up to? Why are you here? Maybe she noticed that we had some notebooks on the table. And we said, well, we're performing poetry, and we told her about our job and how we were presenting all these poems to the school kids. And she said, well, if you're performance poets, you really, really would
get a lot out of going down to Cambridge tomorrow night and seeing Patricia Smith and Ray McNeese perform at TT and the Bears. Now, Al and I really did think we were the great performance poets of our time. And the truth is, we weren't that good. We kind of knew what to do. We could keep the attention of the students, but we had never really studied the subtleties of acting. So we had very little concept around how to play the nuances of a line. But that didn't matter. We still thought we were good, and we didn't have anything to compare it to. So Al and I were curious. So the next night, we boarded the train from Natick to Cambridge, got off in Cambridge, found our way to this venue called TT and the Bears. I remember it being really large. So it was a bar, lots of seats, high stage, and we came in, got ourselves a couple of beers. I was drinking back in those days, and we sat there as two poets, the best in the country, getting ready to watch performance poets perform. And I remember thinking how, well, they couldn't be that good. And sure enough, the first poet out was a tall fellow from Cambridge. Might have been teaching at Harvard, I don't know, but he certainly was stately, and he certainly was academic looking. And his hair was long and black and pushed back and dangled a bit here and there, and he could have been cast in any kind of movie that has a professor in it, if you know what I mean. So the guy stood on stage and he read his work. I mean, he read it. It was about as dull as it could possibly be. He read his work, and it was really, really dull. It was flat. He didn't put any energy in it. There was nothing remarkable about it. And in fact, he was very difficult to hear. So Alan Wolf yells from the back, "We can't hear you in the back." Of course, Alan had great voice projection, so you could hear everything he said across the room. And the fellow pointed his nose to the roof, brushed his hair back, and said in a very haughty voice, "That's your problem." And then he continued to read. And when he was finished, you had polite applause. And Al and I thought, well, this is going to be a boring night. We didn't expect much from the next two poets who were coming up. We knew their names because Suzanne had told us. Ray McNeese, Patricia Smith. So Ray walked out, and honestly, he was dazzling. And we knew it right away. He had long hair, he looked like a rock star, had a great voice, he could sing, he had a drum, he cast his eyes upon the audience and engaged everybody straight away and started to perform. And it was performance in the best sense of a harmonized performance. You could understand every word, you could hear the words, you could see the images. He was living into what he was saying. He was enjoying himself no end. He was completely, utterly synchronized with the art that he was presenting. And that was when Al and I realized that we weren't the best performance poets in the world. We both realized, my God, do we have a long way to go, because this guy is absolutely dazzling. And he finished his set, which was 20 minutes, very short 20 minutes. And then the MC introduced Patricia Smith. And Patricia came out, and she was a different vibe. Patricia was a little bit more contained than Ray. When Patricia stood on the stage, she had a signature stance, which was minimal movement physically, but massive emotional engagement that moved the audience psychologically. It was impossible not to hear her poems, to live into her poems. It was impossible to avoid getting on the narrative train that she was offering up. And her poetry was quite poetic, while at the same time it had a storytelling element as well. It was very easy for us to watch Patricia perform her work. And Patricia Smith, poet, if you want to find out more about her work, and Ray McNeese, poet, if you want to find out more of his work, you can go online and see YouTube videos and whatnot. And to this day, you can look at people on stage presenting their poetry slam pieces, and if you know Ray and you know Patricia and you know how they went about it, you can see a little bit of Ray or Patricia in what's going on right now. Alan and I were certain, after Patricia left the stage, that we had a long, long way to go.
And, I never did manage to reach the level that Ray McNeese or Patricia Smith reached that night. I've done pretty well on stage, but I was never able to do that. And it still continues to be a mystery to me to this day how they did it. So afterwards, as poets tend to do, they were going out, and we knew that. And so we walked up and said, hi, we're touring, we're doing this and that, and we're spoken word poets. And so Patricia and Ray both said, well, let's go out, let's have a meal, let's sit down and talk. So that evening we went out after the show, and I don't know how long we stayed out or how much we said. We did learn that they were as committed to poetry as any two people could possibly be. We also learned that they were part of the Poetry Slam. They were some of the original people who had started with the Poetry Slam. The Poetry Slam started in 1984, 1985, and had been in Chicago for a while. Mark Smith, the founder of the Poetry Slam, started it at the Get Me High Cafe in Chicago and then moved it to the Green Mill. Patricia had been in Chicago, then moved to Boston. Ray was based in Boston. So that's how they came to connect with the Slam in Boston. And I believe they were on a Boston Slam team at the time. So during that evening meal, Patricia and Ray both said, well, you guys should start a slam in Asheville. And they pitched it, and we thought, what a great idea. Alan Wolfe especially thought it was a great idea, and indeed it turned out to be. Alan Wolfe especially thought it was a great idea. So Alan really became the leader of starting the Poetry Slam in Asheville, and I certainly followed close behind, and his wife, Ginger West, also joined, and Lee Lancaster. So we were all inspired to create the Asheville Poetry Slam because Alan Wolfe and I saw the pieces of art on stage at Titi and the Bears, the contrast, the Harvard professor not doing very well, and then Ray McNeese and Patricia Smith dazzled us. And the dazzling is what inspired us, and things unfolded from there. Now, the story I'm telling you now, as we move through this, is not the story that will eventually appear on the Story Slam stage. It's longer. I'm exploring with you the elements of the story to see what I want to put in and what I want to leave out. In some ways you could say, so what? We came to Asheville, we did the Poetry Slam, everybody went home happy. The story needs more than it worked out well, the slam got traction, and we discovered that we really weren't that good at telling poems like Ray and Patricia. So where do you go from there? So here's my idea. Once we started the slam in Asheville, we started to draw many, many people to the Green Door on Carolina Lane. The door is still there. It may not be green anymore, but the entrance is there. And I don't know what is in the basement of the building called the Broadway Arts Building now. But at the time, it was a vital little cafe with a great stage and lots of room to perform in. So I've established that the piece of art, So I've established that Ray and Patricia influenced Alan and me to come to Asheville and create this scene, which rippled out and changed a lot of people's lives. The same thing is true with the Leaf Poetry Slam. And I expect that the Leaf World Changers Story Slam will also change people's lives. What do I mean by that? People will have a positive experience, they'll take it away, tell other people, and they will start making art or making things inspired by what they saw on stage, or if they happen to be on stage, what they did on stage. So that's how a piece of art can inspire somebody to take an action. So if I just leave it at that, I have a story, and it does have some punch. I think it needs one last element. So the element I am choosing to present as a close for this story is an example of some of the characters who came to that venue. And so I'm going to close the story by telling you about Pat Storm, Laura Hope Gill, Alan Wolfe, me, and a few other people on stage at the Asheville Poetry Slam in 1993 or 94. Danny Solis was on stage that night. So we were all committed to doing this. And I have to say, I was never a great slam poet. I managed to do okay.
I got on 3 of the Asheville Poetry Slam teams. I represented well, I suppose. I could never rise to the Ray McNeese, Patricia Smith, Danny Solis level, and there are plenty of others that were just absolutely terrific, and many of whom came through Asheville. Pat Storm was one of them. Now, as I've told you before, the Poetry Slam is when one poet steps on stage and is judged by 5 judges from the audience arbitrarily chosen by the MC or the house manager. So there are lots of variations on this. So this night, we were on stage. People were there, and by the time we were all on stage doing our little improvisational bit, folks were really committed to this. They had already been changed. They were talking about it. People were writing poetry. People were walking through the door and performing. They didn't even know what they were doing. Nobody cared. We were really happy to see it happen. And we were experimenting. And this night we were all on stage doing instant poetry. I think that's what we called it. So the idea was each person dives in and does something, and then somebody else follows them, and somebody else follows them. And it's a bit like bees going in and out of a hive. In, out. So I would do something, and it was a little memorized, a lot made up, and we were just absolutely having a great time. We were cheering everybody on. It was a way of us saying, yeah, you can do this. You can come up, and you can really show your stuff and put yourself out there. And I was pretty bold. I enjoyed what I did, and I felt like I was a fairly good improvisational character on stage. And I learned how to improv by realizing that you improv by saying absolutely nothing. But because you're improving and you're saying nothing, it's interesting to watch. So I probably was doing that night, and the other folks were doing what they do. And then Pat Storm, an interesting guy, long red hair, tattoos down to his hands. This was before tattoos were so popular. Pat had plenty of them. He raised wolves in Tennessee. He was from the Lower East Side of New York and had been a performance poet there. Pat was a rough and tumble guy. He was a bouncer in some of the clubs in the East Village. So you can imagine Pat's prowess around taking care of things when they needed to be taken care of. So Pat was on the stage that night. And he would dive in, and his red hair flew, and he would go, you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and he would recite a line of poetry, and it didn't matter whether it made any sense or not. Pat was totally, utterly, 100% committed to whatever it was he was doing on stage. We were having so much fun, and Pat just steps out from behind the group. You can imagine his deep, loud, booming voice through this echoey room. And he walks out with his arms spread out, and he says, you've got to fight for poetry. You've got to live for poetry. You've got to throw yourself into poetry. And he repeated it again, throw yourself into poetry. And then he said, you've got to dive into poetry. And on dive, Pat jumped off the floor, leveled himself out, and did a full body smash, smack dab on the green stage. It was a green stage, the green door. And we all stopped. And the room went quiet, and Pat was there on the floor, his head to the left side. You could see his profile, and he didn't move at all. And the room went very quiet. And I was standing there thinking, has Pat Storm committed suicide on stage? Did he just actually throw himself on the floor? And as I was thinking that, I knew he hadn't, because that's not what we did. But it just seemed such an illusion of disaster. And then you could see the red ooze out from around Pat's shoulder. And it oozed out on the green stage, red and green. And when people saw that, they really thought things had gone off the porch. And suddenly, Pat started to move. And he rose up from the red on the floor, his red hair flowing, And the people were aghast, eyes wide. Mine were too. And Pat, standing there soaked in red, said, "You've got to live for poetry. You've got to commit for poetry. You've got to dive into poetry." And he was just all revved up, fully alive. No suicide had happened. And it was the most astounding thing I have ever seen. Talk about experimental. Well, as it turned out, you probably already guessed, Pat had a movie blood bag tied to his chest. So when he hit the floor, the bag softened the blow. So it wasn't as big a problem as we thought it was. And of course, the bag also burst and outflowed this red fluid that we all thought was Pat's heart beating its last beat. And people just stood up and cheered, and they loved every second of it. And so Pat's message of you've got to commit, you've got to dive into poetry, and he smashes himself down and then he rises back up again like the phoenix. The idea of rising out of your imperfections into your perfections. And he modeled that for us that night. And that was as powerful for me, watching Pat rise up from the floor, as hearing Ray and Patricia at TT and the Bears. And yet Pat could never have risen from the green door floor without the art that Alan and I had witnessed a year and a half earlier in Cambridge. So from that, we built more and more and more. And the Asheville Poetry Slam became the most vital part of the Poetry Slam scene in the early 90s through the mid-90s. I was on the 1992 Poetry Slam team that went to Boston. I was on the 1993 Poetry Slam team that went to San Francisco. And I was on the 1994 Slam team that competed in Asheville. We came in fourth. And the next year, 1995, in August, the Asheville Poetry Slam team won the Nationals in Ann Arbor. And that same year, in October 1995, was the first Leaf Poetry Slam. And the Asheville team came to the Leaf Poetry Slam and competed amongst each other as well as some other poets. And that was when the Leaf Poetry Slam started. And it overlapped with the Asheville Poetry Slam for a few years until the Asheville Poetry Slam finally faded. Other poetry slams took over. The Leaf Poetry Slam endured. I hosted 2 slams a year up until the pandemic, and now I'm hosting 1 poetry slam a year at the Leaf Festival in October. And now we're hosting. And so now we have a Leaf Global Arts Retreat, May 9 through 10, and I'm hosting the Leaf World Changers Story Slam on Friday night, May the 10th. So now you know my story. I'm not going to be slamming at Leaf, but I might tell that story as a way to warm the judges up. So how do I take that story and condense it to 7 minutes? So first of all, I know that many of the elements that I have in the story, I'll have to shorten or leave out. It's okay to pull things out and put things in. That's the way storytelling happens when you're doing it off the cuff. It's actually not off the cuff. You already know where you're headed, and you plug things in or take things out depending on the time frame. So before I condense the story down, I'm going to have to make sure I have my narrative points lined up so that I have those in my head. So the theme is, how did a piece of art influence me so I made a small or large change in my life and in the community around me? So the Poetry Slam became the change that I made or the actions that I took participating with the community, which created a whole lot of ripples that went out throughout the country. So without any of the bells and whistles, here are the points that I have in my head that I will follow when I tell this story. Uno's Pizza in Natick. Suzanne tells us about the slam. The next night we take the train to Cambridge, find the venue, TT and the Bears, and there we find 2 poets that are much better than we are, Patricia Smith and Ray McNeese. We sit down for a meal and we start developing a friendship. They say, go do a poetry slam. We're so inspired, and we also had enough skill to do it. We went back to Asheville. We opened a poetry slam. We invited people to come. They did. It unfolded very well. A year and a half later, changes had already started to happen. we were deeply involved in it and people were coming. And the end of the story is choosing one person, Pat Storm, to focus on as the change agent that actually sparked out into the community with the inspirational message of dive deep, do what you need to do, and change things. So once you get your storyline in place, the points you want to hit along the way, you can then make decisions about how many details you'd like to put in. And when you start experimenting with putting details in the story as you go along, you'll discover which details work to enhance the story and move it forward, and you'll discover the details that don't work so well. So obviously you'll leave those details out, and you will remember the ones that work well and use them again as you develop the story over and over. It takes probably 10 or 15 times of telling a story like this in order to get a sense of how you want to craft it as you go along through the outline that you have in place. You might be surprised to learn that when you add numbers as details to your stories, you'll push the narrative forward dramatically. I'll give you an example from the story that I'm working on right now. So if I start that story by saying, my friend Alan Wolfe and I were touring the country in New England. We were in Natick, Massachusetts, and we had just finished performing a day of school shows for middle school students. And afterwards, we decided to get a late lunch at Uno's Pizza. So we went to Uno's, sat down, ordered our pizza, and enjoyed the afternoon. That's a perfectly fine opening. You know where we were, what we were doing, and where we were headed to get our pizza. So now I'm going to tell the same opening using numbers, and listen to how much more you engage. And I can also tell you, when I use numbers, I engage more. There's something magical, even mysterious about using numbers. So now here's the same opening with numbers. It was the fall of 1991, and my good friend Alan Wolfe and I had been touring New England for 3 weeks, doing school shows for middle school students, high school students, and elementary school students. And we had 2 more weeks to go on our tour, and so we were right in the middle of the tour, and we had just finished our day at Natick Middle School, and we had performed 2 big shows on the stage and did 2 follow-ups and 1 teacher follow-up. So we had been very busy, so around 3:30 in the afternoon, Alan and I got off work and decided to drive down to Uno's Pizza, which was only 2 miles away, and have a late lunch or an early supper, depending on how you looked at it. So you can see the difference between the 2 openings. For me, the one with numbers connects me more. It also helps me to remember what the place looked like. I now remember that Uno's Pizza was on the 4-lane headed out of Natick. I don't quite know what the name of the road was, but it was the main drag that took you out to the interstate. So I remember it better when I add the 2 miles. We drove down 2 miles to Uno's Pizza. Now, it may have been 2.5 miles, it might have been 3. When you are adding numbers to your story, you can do what is called creative nonfiction. You don't really have to get the exact distance, 2.5 miles. It's important to get a relative distance. Point is, 2 miles is not that far. I don't remember how far Uno's was, but it really wasn't far because we'd been there a couple of times before. So I have all of those memories, and I can put all of those memories into 2-mile drive down to Uno's Pizza. So by adding the number, I'm allowing the listeners to have a relationship with my experience, because we all know how far 2 miles is. So you can personalize things quite a bit with numbers. So for example, if I said, I live on Walnut Street, that's fine. If I say to you, I live at 307 Walnut Street in apartment 2B, you have an image of where I might live. I've told you I live in a building that's divided into at least 2 apartments and maybe more. So you use your imagination to fill in how many apartments might be in the building. So instead of just Walnut Street, you have a very specific image in your mind that helps you connect to whatever story I'm telling, or in this example, whatever story you're telling. So coming back to the Leaf Global Arts World Changers Story Slam, 7 minutes. So if you have a 7-minute time frame, it's probably wise to add some details in the opening. It's also smart to hold back on the details until you get further into the story and get a bead on what kind of pacing you have,
so that you know you're going to be able to close your story on time. And another thing to keep in mind, you don't have to do all of this in your head. I've done it a fair amount, so I feel comfortable putting it together in my head and not writing down a great deal of information, because I can pull it from my own imagination. And the reason why is because I practiced it a fair amount. I trust what my imagination will generate, and I also trust that I'll be able to use my rational mind, my analytical mind, my mathematical mind, to take what my imaginative mind generates and organize it so that it creates a story that everybody can understand, has the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's a relationship between your imagination and your rational mind that makes it work, the collaboration, if you will. So say, for example, if you are not comfortable with that kind of fluidity at first, give it time. It will start to come as you tell your story over and over. If you do have to make a list, keep in mind you want to add appropriate details. So take Pat Storm, for example. Pat did have tattoos down to his wrists. Pat had this amazing flowing red hair. I don't know how long it was. In my mind, it dragged the ground. I don't think so, but there was a lot of it. Pat, I think, had freckles. I don't know for sure if he had freckles or not. He had a deep, raspy voice that boomed and yet was coated with a bit of smoke because he smoked a lot. So he had sort of a smoker's rasping voice. Now, some of this I'm making up. Some of this I'm kind of grasping for. And as I remember Pat, I'm remembering these things. I remember Pat's always bulky guy, lots of muscles. And he was like a football player. And the shirts he wore were not particularly fashionable. They were serviceable, like one would expect from a fellow who lived in Tennessee and raised wolves. Pat said he raised wolves. Maybe he raised a hybrid wolf. I don't know. But the detail of the wolves in Tennessee really fascinates me. So I feel comfortable adding those details. So what you can do is make a list. You have some idea that you would like to develop, some character you would like to develop. So it's perfectly fine to sit down and make a list. For example, I would never say Pat Storm walked into the green door on a slam night and performed in a tuxedo. That was completely beyond Pat. Pat maybe would have performed with his feet bare or in his sock feet, or he may have had a pair of muddy boots on. Now that I think about it, I do remember Pat often wore different kinds of hats. And he had jewelry around his neck as well, and I think he had a bracelet on his left wrist. I don't know if he had a bracelet on his left wrist or not, but I'll bet at one time in knowing Pat Storm, he did have one. So it's perfectly fine for me to put a bracelet on his left wrist. I can't tell you what the bracelet was. I don't remember what kind it was. That doesn't matter. The bracelet on the left wrist gives you, the listener, an opportunity to make that bracelet anything you please. And that's what makes a story work. And that's why those details are important. It's also important to remember that if you need to stretch out your story, feel free to add those details. People love them. And it becomes a fantastic romp into the memories that you have. And you're bringing those memories forward with all those details. And the memories become alive in the present moment. And that's what makes storytelling so compelling. You bring the history of all you know into the present moment, and it's almost as if by magic you create the entire scene all over again for everybody right then and right there. Obviously, we could go on for 2 or 3 more hours about how to tell stories and put them together and craft them. I could talk about it for weeks. I love to talk about this stuff. Unfortunately, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So as we close, please consider the power you have as a storyteller. People love to hear your stories. And if you don't have a venue, if you live in a town with a few friends, consider creating a story salon, inviting folks over and asking them to come and tell some true stories from their lives. And it's really important when you do that to encourage the people you're inviting to bring their simple, ordinary stories. The time a flat tire led you to, say, maybe falling in love. The time a grocery bag broke and everything's tumbled out like Humpty Dumpty onto the sidewalk. I read an article in one of the newspapers last year about 3 ravens in Alaska conspiring at the grocery store parking lot to steal groceries from the bags of the people walking out of the store. They would steal chicken, they would grab things, one raven would dart this way and the other raven would come down and grab the stuff while the person was looking at the other raven. Very strategic ravens. Great story. So imagine if you were carrying a grocery bag and a raven plucked a chicken from it. Well, that would be a story that would be worth telling. So those little ordinary things that happen in our days are full of terrific opportunities to tell stories. I mean, you can tell a story about what happened to you from the time you woke up this morning, brushed your teeth, put on your clothes, came downstairs or didn't come downstairs, walked across the floor, went into the kitchen, made coffee, and went to work. What happened between the time you woke up and the time you walked out the door? Probably the same routine every day. And yet, what was going on in your head? How are you feeling? What was the weather like? Was it warm, cold? Were you excited? Were you sad? What was going on with you? Did you have a sudden memory of somebody you hadn't thought of in years while you were pouring cream in your coffee? All of those things come to play. So if you are in the Asheville area and you would like to attend the Leaf Global Arts Retreat, you can go to theleaf.org and there you'll find out all the information you need for the retreat. It's an all-inclusive weekend. Our Story Slam is on Friday night between 7 and 9 in the Big Barn, which was built by Black Mountain College students in the 40s. The barn is really cool. It's got a great stage, well prepared, great tables, good mics, everything you need to tell a story. So we would love it if you came. You know, how did art affect your life? What's that story? And what kind of changes did you make because of it? We would love to know. And before we go, just one last note on the World Changers Story Slam. We have a 2-hour time slot, which means I can fit 10 people in. So if we have more than 10 people, and hopefully we will put the names in a hat and draw from the hat. So you may or may not get to tell, but it'll still be kind of fun, a bit like a lottery. Who wins the lottery? And if you aren't able to get on the stage, you can certainly sit in the audience and cheer people on. And maybe later, outside after the Story Slam is over, you can tell your tale to somebody who wants to hear it. So it's not just a one-off thing. It's a gathering of folks. And these stories happen between us. I like to think of storytelling as a relationship between the teller on the stage, the audience, and in between the person on the stage, hopefully that's you, and your audience, there's a little wool nest. And we're all energetically dwelling in that wool nest, sharing those stories together. And I just love the image of the wool nest, soft, easy wool, and we're all there, warm, cozy, comfortable. Of course, there's also the campfire idea as well. So, however it plays, hope you can make it to a story stage somewhere. If not a story stage, invite a few friends to come over and just tell your stories. If you need to prompt somebody, just ask them how they fell in love with the person they've been with for a long time. You'll get some pretty good stuff from that. And one more thing, if you would like to go deeper into your writing and into your storytelling, I'm going to be hosting the Lake Eden Writing Week, May 19th through 25th, 2024. That's this May, 2 weeks after the Lake Eden retreat. And there we will dive into an entire week of conversations like the one we've been having here. How do you do this? How do you make all those stories inside of you come out, not only on the page, also on the stage, and also in other ways, like on podcasts and whatnot? So if you have an interest in gathering with a group of people for a whole week, having conversations like this, we would love to have you. And to find out more about that, all you have to do is take a visit to jamesnavé.com, Navé spelled N-A-V-E, and there you will find the link to the information for the Lake Eden Writing Week. So perhaps you'll join us on that. And I think that's pretty much it. We've almost arrived at the last bit of time we have together, so I have just a few more seconds to say, maybe a minute and a half more to say thank you ever so much for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Thank you, Devine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM. We appreciate that. And Robin Collier for managing KCEI-FM, Cultural Energy Radio in Taos. If you would like to reach out to me, like I've said a couple of times already, Navé at jamesnavé.com. I would love to hear from you, especially if you have any questions about the Story Slam we're hosting at Lake Eden Retreat. I'd be glad to answer it and tell you more about it and all of that other stuff. So I think that pretty much covers it for right now. I appreciate you listening, and thank you ever so much for tuning in. And please do tune in again. And until then, I will catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.